It started on one of those long, lonely stretches of highway that seem to go on forever. You know the type, where the trees lean in, swallowing the road, and the only light is the beam of your truck's headlights slicing through the dark. I was hauling a late-night load from Kansas to Colorado, my radio buzzing faintly with static, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee sitting in the cup holder. The night was as quiet as a church on Monday morning. Around mile marker 220, I spotted it, a figure on the side of the road, hunched over like they were fixing a flat or maybe just sitting there. First, I didn't think much of it. You see a lot of strange stuff on the road. But as I got closer, I noticed something off. The figure wasn't sitting or crouched. It was standing completely still, bent at an unnatural angle, like a broken mannequin someone had tossed out. I slowed down, not enough to stop, just enough to get a good look. The figure was a man, tall and lanky, with his head tilted back further than seemed humanly possible. His face, God, his face. It was pale and smooth, like wax, with two black pits where his eyes should have been. No nose, no mouth, just those empty, staring sockets. I hit the gas, hard. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might drown out the growl of the engine. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. You're tired, Chase. Too many hours on the road. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him step onto the asphalt and start walking. If you're a trucker like me, you know the rules of the road. Don't stop unless you absolutely have to, and never, ever pick up hitchhikers. So when I spotted the same man, a few miles down the highway, standing under a broken streetlight, my blood went cold. I hadn't passed any other cars. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. This time, I didn't slow down. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, and barreled past him. But as I sped by, the streetlight flickered on, and I caught a glimpse of something that'll haunt me forever. His face. It wasn't the same. Now, there was a wide, jagged smile where his mouth should have been, like someone had taken a knife to his face. And those empty sockets? They were filled with a deep, glowing red. I drove for what felt like hours, the figure's image burned into my brain. The highway seemed endless, the night darker than ever. I turned on the radio, desperate for some noise, some distraction. But all I got was static. And then, clear as day, a voice crackled through. Chase, it said, low and raspy, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Why won't you stop? I slammed the radio off, my heart pounding. I didn't know how he knew my name, and I didn't want to find out. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop, one of those rundown places where the lights flicker and the bathrooms haven't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of other rigs and a beat-up station wagon. I figured I'd grab some coffee, maybe shake off whatever weirdness I just experienced. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt grease and old cigarettes. The cashier, a tired-looking guy with bags under his eyes, nodded at me as I poured myself a cup of the black sludge they called coffee. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said, his voice flat. Something like that, I muttered, not wanting to get into it. But as I turned to leave, I froze. Through the glass door, I saw him, standing next to my truck, his head tilted, that jagged smile stretched across his face. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the way his skin didn't quite fit, like it was stretched too tight over his skull. Hey, I said to the cashier, my voice shaking. You see that guy out there? The cashier glanced outside, then back at me. What guy? I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. I just sat in my truck, the doors locked, my eyes scanning the mirrors for any sign of him. But he was gone, or so I thought. The rest of the drive was uneventful, almost eerily so. No sign of the figure, no strange voices on the radio. By the time I reached Colorado, I'd almost convinced myself it was all in my head. A hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But then I saw the note. It was tucked under the windshield wiper, written on a scrap of paper that looked like it had been torn from an old notebook. The handwriting was jagged, almost childlike, and the words sent a chill down my spine. See you soon, Chase. I don't know who or what he was, but I do know one thing. I haven't driven that route since. and I never will, because some roads aren't meant to be traveled. After that night, I tried to shake it off. I really did. Truckers like me, we've seen some strange stuff. Sometimes it's just your mind playing tricks, the monotony of the road messing with you. But the thing is, this wasn't just something I could chalk up to a long haul and bad coffee. The note, the way he knew my name, it wasn't over. For a couple of weeks, things were quiet. I stuck to my usual routes, stayed clear of mile marker 220, and tried to pretend like nothing happened. But the feeling didn't go away, that crawling sensation like someone was watching me, even when I was parked at home. Then, about 2 weeks later, I picked up a load heading east. It was supposed to be an easy haul, nothing unusual. The route was familiar, mostly highways with plenty of stops along the way. I was almost looking forward to it. Figured maybe I'd shake off whatever had been haunting me. But somewhere near Missouri, it started again. It was late, past midnight, and the highway was dead. No cars, no lights, just me and the hum of the engine. The moon was full, casting a pale glow over the trees. I remember looking at the clock, 12:47 a.m., when I first heard it. A faint tapping noise, like rain hitting the roof. Except there was no rain. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was drumming their fingers against the cab. My hands tightened on the wheel, my eyes darting to the side mirrors. Nothing, but the tapping didn't stop. It moved, circling the truck, first on the roof, then the passenger side, then the back. I told myself it was just debris, a branch maybe, or something loose in the trailer. But deep down, I knew better. My throat was dry as I glanced at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure was back. He was perched on the top of the trailer, crouched low like some kind of animal. His head was tilted at that unnatural angle, his empty sockets glowing faintly red in the moonlight. And that smile, that horrible, jagged smile, it was wider now, stretching almost ear to ear. I slammed the brakes hard. The truck screeched to a halt, the trailer swaying dangerously behind me. I threw open the door, jumping down into the cold night air. My flashlight was already in my hand as I swung it up, scanning the top of the trailer. Nothing. He was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled into the nearest truck stop, parked under the brightest lights I could find, and locked the doors. But even with the engine off and the cab quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching against the gravel outside. My breath caught in my throat as I peered out the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty parking lot and the glow of the gas station in the distance. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. He was standing at the edge of the lot, just outside the circle of light. His head tilted, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to fire up the truck and get the hell out of there. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. He shouldn't be real. He couldn't be real. And yet, there he was. Then he took a step forward. My hand fumbled for the ignition. I twisted the key, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the truck into gear. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure for just a second before he disappeared. I didn't stop, didn't even look back. I just drove. But as the miles ticked by, I realized something was wrong. The truck felt heavier, like I was hauling more than just cargo. The engine groaned under the strain, the tires struggling to maintain speed. My gut told me to keep going, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over on a desolate stretch of road, the kind where even the shadows seemed alive. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out and walked to the back of the trailer. My breath was visible in the cold night air as I unlocked the doors and swung them open. At first, I didn't see anything. The trailer was empty, just like it should have been. But as I stepped inside, the air grew colder. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out like a dying bulb. That's when I saw them. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the walls and floor of the trailer. They were dark, almost black, and wet to the touch. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. Blood. I slammed the doors shut and jumped back into the cab, my hands shaking as I pulled back onto the highway. I didn't stop again until I reached my destination. But when I dropped off the load and inspected the trailer, the handprints were gone. No blood, no trace of anything unusual. Just an empty truck. That was the last straw. I called my dispatcher and told him I was done, at least for a while. I needed time to figure out what the hell was happening, to get my head straight. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could just leave behind, because no matter where I went, no matter how far I drove, I always felt it. That creeping sensation, like someone was sitting just behind me, waiting, watching. And then one night I found another note. It was tucked under the wiper again, written in that same jagged handwriting. "You can't outrun me, Chase." After I found the second note, I didn't bother pretending everything was fine anymore. I parked my truck in the driveway and locked every damn door in my house. I even nailed a couple of boards over the windows for good measure. Paranoia doesn't even begin to describe what I was feeling. The thing was, I wasn't just scared, I was angry. Who or what was this thing? How did it know my name, where I'd be, and how to leave me those notes without a trace? I hadn't told anyone about what happened on the highway. Hell, I hadn't spoken to anyone other than my dispatcher and the cashier at the truck stop. And yet, it was like this thing was in my head, one step ahead of me every single time. For about a week, nothing happened. No notes, no weird tapping sounds, no glowing red eyes watching me from the shadows. I started to think maybe I'd finally shaken it. Maybe I was just losing it after all. But then, the nightmares started. In the first dream, I was back in my truck, driving down that same dark stretch of highway. The road stretched on forever, and the trees on either side were bare and blackened, like they'd been scorched in a fire. My radio crackled with static, the faint sound of my name whispering through the white noise. "Chase!" I glanced in the mirror, and there he was, sitting in the passenger seat like he'd been there the whole time. His smile stretched impossibly wide, the jagged edges of his teeth catching the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I tried to slam on the brakes, but they didn't work. The truck kept going, faster and faster, the engine roaring like a freight train. "Chase!" he whispered again, his voice like nails scraping down a chalkboard. "Why do you keep running?" I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch black, and for a split second, I thought I saw him standing in the corner, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. But when I blinked, he was gone. The nightmares came almost every night after that, each one worse than the last. Sometimes, I'd see him standing at the foot of my bed, just staring. Other times, I'd wake up to the sound of that tapping, soft at first, then louder, circling the room like he was pacing outside the walls. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to me, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something like him. One night, I finally snapped. I hadn't slept in days, and the constant feeling of being watched was driving me insane. So, I did something stupid. I decided to confront him. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I figured if I faced him head-on, it would all stop. Or maybe I just wanted answers. I grabbed my flashlight, my bat, and a bottle of whiskey for courage, and I headed out to my truck. If he wanted to find me so bad, I'd give him what he wanted. I started driving with no real destination in mind, just cruising down the back roads and waiting for him to show up. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional howl of wind. I kept my eyes on the mirrors, scanning for any sign of him. But mile after mile passed, and there was nothing, just the empty road stretching endlessly into the darkness. And then, around 2 a.m., I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught him standing in the middle of the road, his arms hanging limp at his sides. His head was tilted back, that grotesque smile practically splitting his face in two. I hit the brakes hard. The truck skidded to a stop just feet away from him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty sockets, daring me to do something. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the bat and stepped out of the cab. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing into the night. "Why are you following me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head even further, the bones in his neck making a sickening crack. Then he took a step forward. I swung the bat, aiming for his head. But before it even connected, he vanished, just blinked out of existence, like he was never there. My chest heaved as I looked around, spinning in circles, the bat gripped tightly in my hands. And that's when I heard it, the tapping. It was coming from the truck, loud and frantic, like something or someone was inside. My heart sank as I turned toward the cab, the windows fogged up from the inside. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like whatever was in there was trying to claw its way out. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I crept toward the truck and yanked open the door. The cab was empty. No figure, no fogged windows, just the faint smell of something rotten, like spoiled meat. And on the seat, right where I'd been sitting, was another note. "You can't fight me, Chase. I'm already inside. I haven't driven a truck since that night. Hell, I barely leave the house anymore. But the thing is, I don't think it matters. No matter where I go, no matter how many locks I put on the doors, he's always there, watching, waiting. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed, I hear it, the tapping. After the last note, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I stopped driving, stopped sleeping, and stopped trusting my own shadow. The paranoia was eating me alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was everywhere, lurking in the dark corners of my home, standing just out of sight in my reflection, waiting in the silence when the world went still. But the thing that scared me most wasn't what I could see. It was what I felt. A weight pressing on my chest, a creeping cold that seemed to follow me everywhere. It felt like he wasn't just following me anymore. He was inside me, like he said in the note. It's hard to explain, but I started noticing little things. My hands shaking, a voice in the back of my mind whispering things I didn't want to hear, my reflection in the mirror. Lingering a second too long after I moved, I thought about running. Maybe if I left everything behind, my house, my truck, even my name, I could escape him. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't tied to the truck or the highway. He was tied to me. One night, about a month after I stopped driving, I hit my breaking point. It was around 3 a.m. The house was dead silent, and I was sitting in the living room with every light on, a shotgun across my lap. I hadn't slept in days, and my nerves were so shot I couldn't tell what was real anymore. That's when the tapping started again. It was faint at first, like someone drumming their fingers against the walls, but it got louder, closer. It wasn't just coming from one direction, it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. My breath caught in my throat as I clutched the shotgun tighter, my eyes darting around the room. And then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed me whole, thick and suffocating. My fingers fumbled for the flashlight on the coffee table, but when I clicked it on, the beam barely cut through the black. That's when I saw him, standing at the far end of the room, his silhouette barely visible in the weak light. "Why are you doing this to me?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" He didn't move, didn't answer. He just stood there, his head tilted like he was studying me. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed, not at me, at the hallway behind me. Every hair on my body stood on end as I turned, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The beam lit up the hallway, empty except for the shadows that seemed to ripple and twist like they were alive. And then I saw it, a door I didn't recognize. It was old, with peeling paint and a rusted handle, and it was standing wide open at the end of the hall. The tapping was coming from inside. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there. But something was pulling me toward the door, something stronger than fear. It was like he was drawing me in, daring me to cross the threshold. The closer I got, the colder the air became. My breath fogged in front of me, and the smell of rot grew stronger, almost choking. The tapping was deafening now, echoing around me, filling my head until I thought my skull might split open. I stepped through the door. The room on the other side was wrong. The walls were made of this pulsing, black substance, like living shadows, and the air was thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The tapping was everywhere, but now it was mixed with whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was him. His smile was gone now, replaced by a gaping black void that seemed to stretch endlessly into his face. His eyes burned red, brighter than ever, and his arms hung unnaturally long at his sides, the tips of his fingers brushing the floor. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. He didn't answer, not with words anyway. Instead, he raised one long, spindly finger and pointed at me. And suddenly I understood. He wasn't after me. He was after my fear. Every moment I'd spent running, every sleepless night, every second I'd spent looking over my shoulder. It had been feeding him, making him stronger. He didn't just want to scare me. He wanted to consume me. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe I just didn't have anything left to lose. But instead of running, I stepped closer. "You want me?" I said, my voice shaking. "Then take me. But I'm done being afraid." For the first time, his expression changed. The smile faltered, the red in his eyes dimmed, and the tapping stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive air lifting slightly. I took another step forward, gripping the shotgun tighter. "You don't scare me anymore," I lied. He tilted his head, studying me, and then slowly he began to back away. The shadows around him rippled and twisted, pulling him into the darkness. His form faded, and the last thing I saw before he disappeared was his smile, curling back into that jagged, impossible grin. And then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was back in my living room, the lights flickering back on like nothing had happened. That was 6 months ago, and I haven't seen him since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping. It's faint and distant, like a reminder that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know if I really scared him off or if he's just biding his time. But one thing's for sure, you can't run from the things that haunt you. You can only face them, and hope they don't follow you back. 6 months of quiet was long enough to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I'd beaten him. Sure, I still double-checked my locks and slept with a light on. Sure, the sound of tapping on a window or a creaking floorboard still made my stomach twist into knots. But he hadn't shown up again, and I was slowly starting to believe that whatever I'd done that night had worked. Until last night started like any other evening. I'd fallen into a routine dinner, a couple of beers, and a bad movie on TV to distract myself before bed. Around midnight, I switched everything off and climbed under the covers. Sleep came quickly, too quickly. I dreamed of the highway again, the same endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the dark, the trees leaning in like they wanted to swallow me whole. But this time, I wasn't in the truck. I was standing in the middle of the road, barefoot, the pavement cold under my feet. The air was thick and still, and in the distance, I could see headlights approaching. My heart pounded as the truck drew closer, the rumble of the engine growing louder. Something about it felt wrong. The headlights were too bright, the sound too distorted, like it was coming from underwater. The truck slowed as it reached me, the engine idling as the cab came to a stop just a few feet away. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. The door swung open, and a figure climbed out. It was me. I stared, my breath caught in my throat as my double stepped onto the pavement. He looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same haircut, same tired eyes. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. He smiled, and that's when I saw it. The jagged edges. The same impossible, unnatural grin I'd seen on him. "Why are you here?" I managed to croak. My double tilted his head, studying me with those empty black eyes. "I told you, Chase," he said, his voice a distorted echo of mine. "I'm already inside." I woke up gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. Then I heard it, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls or the windows. It was coming from inside the house. I grabbed the shotgun from under my bed, the barrel cold in my hands as I crept toward the noise. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking just softly enough to drive me insane. It led me down the hallway, past the living room and into the kitchen. That's when I saw the door. It wasn't the same as before, no peeling paint or rusted handle. This one was pristine, like it had just been installed. It didn't belong, couldn't belong. And yet, there it was, standing wide open at the far end of the room. The tapping stopped. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't want to go through that door. Not again. But I knew, deep down, that this was it. This was the end of the road, one way or another. So I tightened my grip on the shotgun and stepped through. The room on the other side was completely dark. Not just dark, empty. Felt like stepping into a void, like the world had been erased around me. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, out of the darkness, I heard his voice. "You've been running for so long, Chase. Aren't you tired?" I spun around, aiming the shotgun into the void. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Let's end this." His laughter echoed all around me, deep and guttural. "End it?" he said. "Oh, Chase, this is only the beginning." Suddenly, the room wasn't empty anymore. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their shapes twisted and wrong. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Others stood hunched, their heads cocked like they were listening to something I couldn't hear. All of them had that same jagged smile, those same glowing red eyes. And at the center of them all was him. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The figures parted for him, their heads turning to watch as he approached. His smile was wider than ever, stretching so far it looked like it might split his face in half. "You can't fight me, Chase," he said, his voice low and distorted. "You can't escape. You can't win. I'm a part of you now." For a moment I froze. He was right, I couldn't fight him. Not here. Not in this place. But maybe I didn't have to. "You want to be a part of me?" I said, lowering the shotgun. "Fine. Let's see if you can handle it." Before he could react, I raised the barrel to my chest and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, the world went white. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my kitchen, the shotgun clutched in my hands. My chest was heaving, but there was no blood, no wound, just the faint smell of smoke and the distant echo of his laughter. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I drove him out or if he's still hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I do know one thing. I'm still here, and as long as I'm breathing, I'll keep fighting. Because sometimes, the only way to beat the darkness is to let it know you're not afraid to face it. Even if it means staring into the void and daring it to stare back. After that night, I thought I'd broken the cycle. The shotgun blast, the confrontation, it felt like I'd taken control for the first time since this nightmare began. For weeks, things were quiet. No tapping, no notes, no red eyes watching me from the shadows. But the quiet didn't bring peace. It brought something worse. The first sign that something wasn't right came about a month after I pulled the trigger. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, shaving. My hand was steady, my face calm. For the first time in months, I looked like myself again. But as I leaned in to rinse the blade, I caught it, the tiniest flicker of movement in the corner of the mirror. It wasn't me. It was my reflection. It lingered, just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Its eyes locked on mine even as I turned away. My heart stopped. I forced myself to look back, but by then it was gone. Just my own tired face staring back. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a leftover thread of fear my mind hadn't let go of yet. But deep down, I knew better. The next time, it was the tapping. It started faint, almost imperceptible, so soft I could have sworn it was my imagination. But it grew louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't on the windows or walls. It was coming from inside my head, like a second heartbeat pulsing in my skull. "Not again," I muttered, clutching my temples as I staggered to the kitchen. I turned on every light in the house, the shadows shrinking back to the corners. The tapping didn't stop. It followed me, growing louder with each step. And then it stopped. Dead silence. I turned around, and there he was. He wasn't standing in the shadows this time. He wasn't lurking in my mirrors or hiding behind doors. He was right there, standing in the middle of the room, grinning that jagged, impossible grin. His form was clearer now, more solid. Like he wasn't just some figment of my imagination anymore. "You can't get rid of me, Chase," he said, his voice low and guttural. "I'm not just inside your head. I am your head." I tightened my grip on the counter, my knuckles white. "You don't scare me anymore." His smile widened, the edges of his mouth splitting further. "Oh, I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to show you the truth." Before I could move, the lights flickered and went out. The room was swallowed by darkness, and the floor beneath me felt like it dropped away. When the lights came back on, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was back on the highway, the same stretch of road where it all began, the asphalt stretching endlessly in both directions. But this time I wasn't alone. He was there, standing in the middle of the road, his form towering and distorted, like a shadow made flesh. And behind him, the highway was lined with figures. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all standing perfectly still. Their faces were blurred, their features twisted and wrong, but I knew who they were. They were me. Each one was a version of myself. Every mistake, every regret, every fear I'd ever tried to bury. They stared at me with those hollow, glowing eyes, their mouths curling into identical, jagged smiles. "This is who you are," he said, spreading his arms wide. "All your failures, all your fears. You can't escape them, Chase. You can't escape me." For a moment I froze. The weight of it all, the faces, the voices, the memories, it was crushing. He was right. I'd spent my whole life running from the things I couldn't face, the things I didn't want to admit, and now they were here, staring me down. But then, something shifted. I looked at the figures on the side of the road, and I realized something. They weren't just my failures. They weren't just my fears. They were mine. I'd survived every one of them. They hadn't broken me. They'd shaped me, made me stronger. "You're wrong," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "You're not who I am. You're just the parts of me I haven't dealt with yet. And I'm done running." His smile faltered, just for a second. The figures on the highway began to blur, their edges softening as if they were fading away. "No," he growled, stepping toward me. "You can't fight me. You'll never be rid of me." "Maybe not," I said, stepping forward to meet him. "But I'm not afraid of you anymore." The moment I said it, the air around us shifted. The figures disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. His form began to waver, his edges flickering like a dying flame. He snarled, his jagged smile twisting into a grimace as he reached for me, but his hand passed right through me. "You can't," he hissed, his voice breaking. "You can't." And then he was gone. I woke up on my living room floor, the first rays of dawn spilling through the window. The house was silent, the air still. For the first time in months, I felt free. I don't know what he was. Some kind of entity, a manifestation of my own mind, or something else entirely. And I don't know if he's truly gone, or if he's just waiting, lurking in the shadows for another chance. But here's what I do know. I faced him. I looked him in the eye and didn't blink. And if he ever comes back, I'll be ready. Because the only way to beat the darkness is to own it. To let it know that no matter how deep it gets, you'll always find a way to rise above. And for the first time in my life, I'm not running anymore.